I found a box under my bed at the orphanage with a farm deed and my dead mother's name on it. Before we dive in, hit subscribe real quick. Tomorrow's story is going to absolutely wreck you in the best way possible. I was 17 when I discovered it, just 3 months before I'd age out of Greenwood Children's Home, the only place I'd known since I was 5 years old. I was cleaning under my bed, something I rarely did, when my hand hit something taped to the bed frame. A metal lockbox, small and rusted, secured with duct tape that had been there so long it practically crumbled when I touched it. My hand shook as I pried it loose. The box wasn't locked, just latched, and inside I found documents that made no sense. A property deed for 83 acres in rural Montana. The name on it read Sarah Ann Clark, transferred to Emma Rose Clark upon her 18th birthday, or legal emancipation from state care. My name, my mother's name. I'd been told my whole life that my mother died when I was 4, that she'd been alone with no family and nothing to leave me except a ratty stuffed rabbit I'd lost years ago. The social workers said she'd gotten sick, couldn't care for me anymore, and I'd been surrendered to the state. No other details, no relatives who wanted me, nothing. But here was proof that she'd owned land, 83 acres somewhere called Holloway Valley, and she'd made sure it would transfer to me. I pulled out my phone and searched for Holloway Valley, Montana. It took me to a tiny dot on the map, population 214, nestled in the mountains about 6 hours north of where I'd grown up. The satellite images showed endless forest, a few scattered buildings, and what looked like farmland carved into the hillsides. Beneath the deed was a handwritten letter on lined paper, the ink faded but still readable. "My sweet Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're almost grown. I'm so sorry I couldn't stay with you, baby girl. Being sick isn't something I could fight my way out of, no matter how hard I tried. But I made sure you'd have something real when you were old enough. The farm isn't much, just a little cabin and some land my grandfather left me. I never did anything with it because I was too busy trying to make it in the city, trying to give you a better life than I had. That didn't work out the way I planned, but the farm is yours now. There's a man named Joe Hendricks who lives next door. He's been watching the place for me, making sure it doesn't fall apart. Find him when you get there. He'll help you understand everything. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Build yourself a good life, Emma. You deserve it. Mom." I read the letter 4 times, tears blurring the words. My mother had thought about me, had planned for me, had left me something real, not just fading memories and unanswered questions. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept pulling up images of Holloway Valley on my phone, trying to imagine what the farm looked like, what kind of life might be waiting for me there. 3 months felt like forever when all I wanted to do was go right then, that very moment. But I didn't have a car. I had exactly $372 saved from working at the library, and a bus ticket to Montana would cost most of that. Plus, I needed Miss Cooper, my caseworker, to sign off on any travel before I turned 18. And explaining this to her meant questions I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Miss Cooper. She was a tired woman in her 50s who handled 37 cases and never remembered half our names. When I showed her the documents, her eyebrows shot up. "Where did you find these?" she asked, examining the deed carefully. Under my bed. They were taped there. I think maybe my mom left them when she brought me here. That was a lie. I had no memory of coming to Greenwood. But Miss Cooper didn't need to know I'd only just discovered the box. She spent 20 minutes making phone calls, verifying that the deed was legitimate, that the property still existed, that there weren't any liens or back taxes that would make it worthless. When she finally hung up, she looked at me differently than she ever had before. "Emma, this is real. The property is fully paid off, no outstanding debts. There's even a small trust account that's been paying the property taxes for the last 13 years. Looks like it was set up by your mother before she passed. You're actually going to own land in 3 months." The reality of it hit me like a wave. I wasn't going to age out homeless like so many kids from Greenwood. I had somewhere to go, somewhere that was mine. Can I visit it before I turn 18? I just want to see the place. Miss Cooper considered this. I'll need to arrange supervision. Make sure you're safe. Let me contact this Joe Hendricks person and see if he's willing to help. If everything checks out, we can probably arrange a trip next month. That month crawled by slower than any period of time in my entire life. I researched Montana farming, read everything I could about Holloway Valley, and tried to prepare myself for whatever I'd find. Miss Cooper eventually connected with Joe Hendricks, who turned out to be a 68-year-old retired logger who'd known my grandfather decades ago. "Your mama was a sweet girl," he told me over the phone, his voice rough but kind. "She came out here once when she was about your age, spent a summer fixing up the cabin. Then she left for the city, and I never saw her again. But she sent me money every year to keep an eye on things, make sure nobody vandalized the place. I've been waiting a long time to meet you, Emma." In mid-February, Miss Cooper drove me to Montana. We left at 4 in the morning, the highway stretching endlessly through darkness and then gradually into snow-covered mountains as the sun rose. I pressed my face against the window, watching the landscape transform from flat farmland to rolling hills to steep valleys carved between peaks. Holloway Valley was even smaller than I had imagined. One main street with a post office, a general store, a diner, and a bar that had seen better decades. Miss Cooper followed the directions Joe had given us, turning onto a dirt road that wound up into the hills. The cabin appeared after about 2 miles, set back in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, built from dark logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. The roof looked solid, though moss grew thick on the north side. A stone chimney rose from the center, and a covered porch wrapped around the front. Joe Hendricks was waiting on that porch, a tall man with white hair and a flannel jacket. He climbed down the steps as we parked, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "You look just like your mama," he said, shaking my hand. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Welcome home, Emma." Home. The word hit different, coming from someone who'd known my mother, who'd protected this place for her. He showed us around the property, pointing out the boundaries, the small creek that ran along the eastern edge, the cleared area where my great-grandfather had once grown vegetables. The cabin itself was simple but solid. One main room with a kitchen area, a wood stove, and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder. No running water yet, though there was a well out back. An outhouse stood discreetly behind a cluster of trees. "It's rustic," Joe admitted, "but the bones are good. Your mama had plans to modernize it eventually, put in plumbing and electricity never got the chance, but those things can be added if you want to invest in it. I climbed up to the loft and looked out the small window at the valley below. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still white with snow. The silence was profound, broken only by wind in the pines and the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. This was mine, this view, this silence, this possibility. What happens next changes everything about what I thought I knew. Stay with me and hit that subscribe button. We spent 3 hours at the cabin before Miss Cooper said we needed to head back. Joe walked me around one more time, showing me where property lines ran, pointing out the old apple trees that still produced fruit, explaining which neighbors were friendly and which kept to themselves. "When you come back for good, you come find me first," he said. "I'll help you get settled, show you how to work the land if that's what you want. Or you can sell it, make a fresh start somewhere else. Your choice, Emma. But this place has been waiting for you, and I think it's got more to offer than you realize." On the drive back, Miss Cooper was quieter than usual. Finally, she said, "You're lucky, Emma. Most kids who age out have nothing. You've got options now. Don't waste them." I turned 18 on April 23rd. Greenwood threw their standard aging out ceremony, a cake in the common room, and envelopes with resource information about housing assistance and job programs. 3 other kids were graduating out with me. One was moving in with a boyfriend. Another had joined the military. The third had no plan and kept making jokes about living in his car. I had a place to go. 2 days later, I loaded everything I owned into a duffel bag and backpack, said goodbye to the few staff members who'd been kind over the years, and caught a Greyhound headed north. The bus took 9 hours with stops, and I spent most of it staring out the window, trying to imagine what my new life would look like. Joe picked me up at the tiny bus station in Holloway Valley. He'd brought supplies, groceries, and propane and firewood, enough to get me started. "Figured you'd want some time alone to settle in," he said. "But my place is just 2 miles down the road, if you need anything. And I mean anything, Emma. You're not on your own out here." The cabin felt different as mine, rather than just a place I was visiting. I unpacked my few belongings, started a fire in the wood stove, and made myself dinner using the camp stove Joe had left. As darkness fell, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, and looked up at more stars than I'd ever seen in my life. No streetlights, no city glow, just endless sky and the sound of the forest settling around me. I'd been alone my whole life in some ways, surrounded by people in the orphanage, but never really belonging to anyone. Here, the aloneness felt different, chosen, peaceful. Over the next few weeks, I learned what it meant to live off-grid. I hauled water from the well, chopped firewood, cooked simple meals, and started exploring my property. 83 acres turned out to be a lot of land when you were walking it on foot. I found an old barn that was mostly collapsed, clearings where buildings had once stood, and endless forest, thick with undergrowth. Joe came by every few days, teaching me practical skills like how to maintain the well pump, how to identify which trees were dead and could be safely cut for firewood, how to read the weather by watching the sky. He also told me stories about my great-grandfather, a man named Thomas Clark, who'd homesteaded this land in 1947. "Thomas was tough as nails," Joe said one afternoon as we worked on clearing brush from around the cabin. came back from the war and wanted nothing to do with cities. He built this cabin with his own hands, raised 5 kids here, and never left the valley except for supplies. Your grandfather inherited the place, but moved away after Thomas died. Your mama got it when she turned 21, but by then she'd already made a life elsewhere. Did you know her well? I asked. Joe paused, leaning on his rake. Only that one summer when she was here. She was determined to make the cabin livable again, spent 3 months working dawn to dusk. She talked about bringing you here someday, giving you the kind of childhood she'd never had, but I guess life had other plans. That night, I found myself crying for the first time since I'd arrived, mourning the mother I barely remembered, and the life we might have had together in this place. But tears didn't change anything. I wiped my eyes and got back to work. A month into living on the property, I got a job at the general store in town. The owner, a woman named Patricia, needed help with inventory and stocking. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to buy food and start saving toward eventual improvements on the cabin. Patricia was curious about me, in the way small-town people are, asking questions, but not pushing when I didn't want to elaborate. She knew I'd inherited the Clark property, knew I'd come from somewhere down south, and seemed content with that. Through her, I met other people in Holloway Valley. Rachel, who ran the diner and made the best biscuits I'd ever tasted. Marcus, a younger guy about 25, who worked construction and offered to help with projects when I was ready. Linda, an older woman who'd been friends with my great-grandfather and remembered my mother's visit years ago. "You've got Thomas's stubbornness," Linda told me one day at the post office. "I can see it in the way you move, the way you talk. That man could outwork anyone and never complain about it. If you've got even half his determination, you'll make something of this place." I started making plans. The cabin needed a new roof before next winter. The well could use upgrading. Eventually, I wanted running water and maybe solar panels for electricity. But all of that cost money I didn't have yet. Then Joe mentioned something that changed my perspective entirely. "You know you've got timber rights on this property?" he said one evening as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. "About 40 acres of your land is mature forest. With lumber prices what they are, you could do a selective harvest, take out the best trees while leaving the forest healthy. Might net you $20,000 or $30,000 if you work with the right company. $20,000. That could transform the cabin, make it actually livable year-round. But the idea of cutting down trees on my property made me hesitate. This land had been wild for so long. Did I have the right to change it? "It's sustainable forestry," Joe explained, sensing my reluctance. "You're not clear-cutting. You take the mature trees that are ready, leave the younger ones to grow. The forest regenerates itself. Thomas did it every 20 years or so, and the land never suffered for it." I thought about it for days, walking through the forest and trying to imagine which trees would be selected, what the landscape would look like afterward. Finally, I decided to at least talk to a forestry company and see what they recommended. The consultant who came out was a woman named Diane, probably in her 40s, who walked my property with practiced efficiency. She marked certain trees with colored tape, explained which species were valuable, and laid out a plan that would harvest less than 15% of the total forest. Your great-grandfather managed this land well, she said, reviewing her notes. The trees are healthy, well-spaced, prime quality. I'd estimate this selective harvest would bring you around $32,000 after our fees. And the forest will be healthier for it. More light reaching the undergrowth, better growth rates for the remaining trees. $32,000. I could barely process that amount of money. I signed the contract 2 weeks later. The logging crew came in late July, working for 10 days with equipment that seemed impossibly large, navigating the narrow forest paths. I watched them work, feeling anxious every time a tree fell, but Joe stood beside me and pointed out how carefully they operated. See how they're leaving all those young trees? How they're avoiding the creek bed? This is good forestry, Emma. Your great-grandfather would approve. When they finished and wrote me the check, I stared at the numbers until they blurred. $32,416, more money than I'd ever imagined having. Joe helped me open a bank account and plan how to use it wisely. First priority was the roof, installed by Marcus and his crew over a long weekend. Then we upgraded the well system and ran a water line into the cabin, giving me a sink and the foundation for eventual plumbing. I bought a better wood stove, insulated the loft properly, and replaced the windows with double-paned glass that would keep heat in during winter. By September, the cabin had transformed from a primitive shelter into an actual home. I still didn't have electricity beyond solar panels for lights and charging devices, but I had running water, a warm, efficient heating system, and weatherproof walls. I celebrated by inviting Joe, Patricia, Rachel, Marcus, and Linda over for dinner. We crowded into my small space, eating soup I'd made on my propane stove and cornbread from Rachel's recipe, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. Belonging. These people had accepted me without question, helped me without expecting anything in return, and welcomed me into their community like I'd always been here. Your mama would be so proud, Linda said, raising her glass of cider. To Emma, who took a forgotten piece of land and turned it into a home. We toasted, and I fought back tears because this feeling of being part of something was worth more than any amount of money. As fall turned to winter, I settled into rhythms that felt ancient and right. Chopping wood, hauling water, reading by lamplight. The silence that had felt intimidating at first became comforting, a blanket of peace I wrapped around myself each night. I started learning about permaculture and sustainable farming from library books Patricia ordered for me. I planned what I'd plant come spring, drew diagrams of garden beds and berry patches, imagined the property 5 years from now, 10 years from now, producing food and beauty. Joe taught me to hunt, and though I wasn't sure I could actually shoot an animal, I learned the skills anyway. Just knowing I could survive if I needed to felt empowering. Winter in Montana was brutal and beautiful. Snow piled 4 feet deep around the cabin. I learned to snowshoe to reach the road where I'd parked my newly purchased truck, a beat-up Ford that ran on determination and constant repairs. I learned which sounds meant the roof was handling the snow load and which meant I needed to get up there and shovel. And through it all, I read and reread my mother's letter, trying to understand the woman who'd given me this chance. In March, as snow began melting and the first hints of spring appeared, I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I understood. I was cleaning out a storage area under the cabin's floor, a space I'd been avoiding because it was dark and full of spiders. Way in the back, I found a metal box similar to the one that had been taped under my bed at Greenwood. Inside were letters, dozens of them, spanning years. They were addressed to my mother from someone named Eleanor Clark, my grandmother, a woman I'd been told died before I was born. The letters told a different story. Eleanor had been alive when I was born. She'd written to my mother regularly, begging her to come home to Montana, offering to help raise me, promising support and family. But my mother had refused, determined to make it on her own in the city, too proud or too hurt to accept help. The letters grew desperate as my mother got sicker. Eleanor offered money for treatment, offered to take me if my mother couldn't care for me anymore, offered everything she had. The last letter was dated 3 months before my mother surrendered me to the state. "Sarah, please," it read, "you're dying and you won't let me help. At least send Emma to me. She belongs here with family, not in some institution. I'm begging you. Let me know my granddaughter before it's too late." But my mother never responded, never told Eleanor where to find me, never let her mother back into her life after whatever rift had separated them years before. And Eleanor had died 2 years after I entered the system, never knowing what happened to me, never getting the chance to be my grandmother. I sat on the cabin floor, surrounded by letters, and cried for all of us. For my mother, who'd been too stubborn to accept help. For Eleanor, who'd tried so hard to fix things. For myself, who'd lost years of family because of pride and hurt feelings. But mixed with the grief was something else. Understanding. My mother had left me the farm because it was the only way she knew to give me what Eleanor had offered. A home, a foundation, a place to belong. She couldn't swallow her pride while she was alive, but she'd made sure I'd have family land when I was old enough to claim it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the childhood Eleanor had wanted to give me, but it was something real, something lasting, something that had waited patiently for me to be ready. I gathered up the letters and put them in a safe place. Then I walked outside into the March evening and looked at the mountains still white with snow, the forest beginning to show hints of green, the creek running high with meltwater. This land had been loved by Thomas, by Eleanor, by my mother in her own complicated way. Now it was mine to love, to protect, to build a life on. I wasn't going to waste it. Spring came fast after that, the way it does in Montana. One day, everything was snow and mud, and the next, wildflowers exploded across the meadow, and birds filled the trees with sound. I planted my first garden with seeds Joe helped me choose: potatoes, beans, squash, tomatoes, herbs. I built raised beds using lumber from trees harvested off my own land. I started composting, learned about crop rotation, made 100 mistakes, but kept trying. By summer, the garden was producing more than I could eat. Rachel taught me to can and preserve, and my small pantry filled with jars of tomatoes, pickles, and jam made from wild berries I'd gathered in the forest. I also started a small business making furniture from timber I harvested myself. Marcus taught me basic woodworking, and I discovered I had a knack for it. Simple pieces at first, benches and tables, but gradually more complex designs. Patricia sold them in the general store, and tourists passing through started buying my work. It wasn't going to make me rich, but combined with my part-time job, it was enough to live on. More importantly, it was satisfying in a way nothing else had ever been. creating something beautiful from raw materials, using skills my hands were learning, building a business from nothing. 2 years after arriving in Holloway Valley, I stood on my porch and realized I was happy. Actually, genuinely happy in a way I'd never experienced during all those years in the system. The cabin was warm and solid. The garden was thriving. I had friends who cared about me and work that gave me purpose. I had land that connected me to generations of family I'd never known but could feel in the bones of this place. My mother had given me more than property. She'd given me the chance to build a life on my own terms, to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by being an orphan or a foster kid or someone with no family. I was Emma Clark, landowner, carpenter, gardener, neighbor, friend. I was someone who belonged somewhere, who had roots that went deep into Montana soil. And every night when I looked up at those endless stars, I whispered thank you to the mother I barely remembered, to the grandmother I never met, to the great-grandfather who'd first cleared this land and built something lasting. They'd all left me something more valuable than money. They'd left me home. Thank you for joining me on Emma's journey from the orphanage to finding her place in the world. If this story moved you, please subscribe and check out the other incredible stories on screen. I'd love to hear in the comments, have you ever discovered something about your family that changed how you see yourself? Drop your story below